recognize the ranking member for opening statement. I yield to the ranking member for an opening statement. I yield back.
Good morning, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Distinguished gentlelady from California, Mary Bono.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Chair now recognizes
the lady from California is recognized.
I'm pleased to introduce Congresswoman Mary Bono, former U.S. Representative for California's Inland Empire and Desert Region from 1998 to 2013.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Welcome to Sagely Speaking. I'm your host, Mary Bono. I'm glad you're here. If you would please subscribe to our podcast and leave a 5-star rating or give us a thumbs up, depending on your platform, it would absolutely make our day. A special thank you to our sponsors for your support. And now let's get right to our guest, William Cope Moyers. He's Vice President of Public Affairs and Community Relations for the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation. A little background first on the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation. It has a legacy that began in 1949 and includes the 1982 founding of the Betty Ford Center. It is a force of healing and hope for individuals, families, and communities who are affected by substance use and mental health conditions. And now let's get back to my friend William. William, you've had a 28-year career at Hazelden. How did you get started in that?
Well, Mary, thanks for having me on. I love to connect with people who've been around for a while like you and are making a difference wherever you're making a difference these days. So thanks a lot. Mary, I'm an alum of Hazelden from 1989. I went to treatment at the age of 30 years old. I came out from New York to Minnesota, where I now live, to start my journey in recovery. It took me 4 treatments over 5 years before I learned to take personal responsibility for managing my chronic illness to addiction. And then in 1996, I blundered into a job at Hazelden. I answered a classified ad. I was hired as a policy analyst in 1996 to really analyze policy around expanding access to treatment. And as you know, very shortly thereafter, there was a big push in Congress to get insurance companies to cover addiction treatment like they covered other chronic illnesses. So that's how I got to Hazelden. That's how I began my professional career after years in journalism. And then lastly, I discovered when I got to Hazelden in 96 that the most important thing I could do was to share my story, to stand up and speak out as a person in recovery, because there's such a stigma, as you know, there's such a stigma around addiction, and the fact that that the public generally and the policymakers don't really see us when we get better, because we get better. So I started to use my own story as a public advocate, and here we are.
And here we are. But you said something that I think is very important for people to hear. It took you 4 stays in rehab,
yes,
4 stays in treatment in 5 years. I think it's important for people to hear that this is a tough journey. It takes a lot of work, and it isn't an instantaneous cure. I know a lot of parents who think that they can send their child off to in-treatment facilities, and 30 days later they come back and their child is perfect.
Right.
And that's not true. And I think it's important it's so important parents know that, because they put undue pressure, I think, on the patient or on the child,
yes,
to be fixed and perfect in 30 days. And that's not true.
It's not true. I mean, I wish it was true, but it's like any other chronic disease, whether it's diabetes, hypertension, depression, there is no cure for those illnesses. Now, there is a solution, thank goodness, and organizations like Hazelden Betty Ford and people like me can live in that solution, but it's a chronic disease. It tends to come back. I'm very lucky or blessed because I had the support of my family. I had access to care. This was before insurance was covering it. I had some resources in my pocket to help cover my stay. But yeah, just like diabetes or hypertension or any of those other chronic illnesses, the patient has to have a role, not just in the problem, but also in the solution. So I was lucky to get those 4 shots over 5 years before to learn how to manage my illness.
But you mentioned educating policymakers, and having been one, and having been an advocate, not quite as forceful as you, but nonetheless, I try my hardest. Policymakers looked at this as moral failing. Doesn't happen in my district, not going to happen here. It happens under the bridge elsewhere. They never look at the larger societal issues that come from it. I remember the early days, especially mental health parity and all the things that we fought for, and we always ran into a wall. That wall of stigma. Was it a huge impediment for your advocacy early in the days? And did you ever feel stigmatized yourself when you were doing some of that work?
Mary, I never felt personally stigmatized because I clean up really well. I've got a well-known last name. I work for an institution that's well regarded. But exactly to your point, policymakers on both sides of the aisle think that addiction is some other problem in some other district. I've always said that addiction is a bipartisan illness that demands a bipartisan solution. And it did take a long time before policymakers in red states and in blue states on both sides of the aisle recognized that this is everybody's problem. And if we're going to solve it, we need everybody to get involved in it. And that's why I spent a lot of those early years, especially trying to get other people to stand up and speak out and share their own experiences as addicted people from families that were good families with a bad problem. And that took a long time. But to your point, we finally, I think, did mount a campaign that succeeded in getting Congress to pass that important legislation in 2008 and then getting President Bush to sign it into law.
Huge victory there. And you have to credit a lot to Patrick Kennedy and Jim Ramstad, former colleagues of mine. But William, I have a funny story, and I don't know if you know this one, but when they created the Addiction Caucus, I went up to him and I was so excited. And I don't remember if it was Patrick or Jim or both. I said, I'm going to join your caucus. And they looked at me like, you can't join our caucus. You're not in recovery. And because, clearly it was political, but it was also somewhat of a support group and kindred spirits. But I had to explain to them, well, I tend to love people who have addiction problems. I just do. And so I really had to kind of crack them open to realize that this is bigger and you should bring in the families and expand the caucus.
Good story.
But it was so funny because I remember the looks on their faces. It was like, what? You want to do what? Nobody wants to join this caucus. But it was, you said it's a bipartisan problem with bipartisan solutions, and this was a perfect example. And unfortunately, both Jim and Patrick are no longer in the Congress, but the work together was seamless.
Well, and what was so important about those times, Mary, is that it did cobble together this bipartisan approach. And that became crucial when we as a nation began to struggle with the opioid epidemic, which was an opioid epidemic that tended to, it affected everybody, of course, but in particularly in red states, it was worse than an epidemic. It was a tidal wave of despair and death that was affecting not just the person who had the dependency, but also, to your point, the family and the community. And so we were very fortunate that we had gotten the parity legislation passed in 2008 and then 2 years later got it included in the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, because a lot of those states have come to rely on private insurance and public insurance to help meet head on this opioid epidemic.
Look, I hear a lot from my listeners about why don't I take my guests on about this or that, or what didn't work, or let's delve deeper into what didn't work and why didn't work. Without getting into Obamacare, I just don't want to touch that. But I do want to say it was the vehicle that did help countless families and countless communities with this problem separate from Obamacare. It was a vehicle that it was tied to, and it was pivotal in our country to see mental illness as an illness like any other physical illness, and very, very important.
Great point.
But William, you said something that I need to jump all over.
Uh-oh.
No, in a positive way. You work at an institution that is well regarded, and I consider Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation to be the gold standard in the world for treatment and recovery. And you probably know or remember that President Gerald Ford was my campaign chairman, and Betty Ford was a dear friend. And after President Ford passed, she was my campaign chair. So not only do I believe you are the gold standard, I have such personal ties, and I have a lot of friends and family who have benefited from their time. I can't say at their time with, because I think once you attend, you're an alumni, and it's a forever thing. So I just want to say that. So to thank you all, because I've seen a lot of the battles you have all faced over the past decade, 15 years, on the changes in the treatment recovery landscape.
Yeah, Mary, thanks for saying that. Hazelden started, we just finished celebrating our 75th anniversary here in the Twin Cities, well, across our whole system of care. But we've been around for 75 years. And in the early 1980s, Mrs. Ford came to Minnesota because she wanted to open a treatment center in the desert. And she wanted to get the very best of the best in terms of the clinical approaches, the operational approaches, and we sort of passed it on to her. And then she, of course, took it back to the desert and started the Betty Ford Center. Who would have ever imagined that in 2014, the two organizations would merge to become the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation? We're a much better institution today because of the passion of Mrs. Ford, the competency of Hazelden and our leaders, and the fact that we have come together in this way.
And of course, Mrs. Ford was never afraid of stigma, originally. And then she broke through that and decided to be such a terrific champion for not only people who are dealing with any addiction, but families. And families are hugely important. And Betty Ford, Hazelden do a great job dealing with families. But as if you weren't busy enough, one day you decided, 2006, you decided to write a memoir titled Broken. And it was a New York Times bestseller. Did you feel confined after you wrote that book? Did you describe a life that you had to adhere to from then on? Or what lessons did you learn from Broken?
Great question. Thank you for asking it. So Broken is an authentic story. It's my story. I wrote it in 2006. At that point, I had been in continuous recovery since 1994. So it's 12 years later. And the story that I wrote was a V-shaped recovery. I went down, and then I hit my bottom and I went up, right? And I lived happily ever after. The point being that stuff happens. And 19 years later, I had to write another memoir, which I know we'll talk about in a minute. But Broken was, it was called Broken, My Story of Addiction and Redemption. And it was a true story. What I discovered, Mary, later on when I had some additional struggles with my own recovery was that there was nothing out in the literature of recovery any more than there was anything in the addiction memoir genre that talked about recovery from addiction long after the drink or the drug is put down. And that's why I think my new book really will resonate with people, because I'm not going to date you, but I'm 65 years old. And, there's 6,000 of us turning 65 every day in this country in 2024, which means that a lot of us are going to be grappling with older age issues. And as recovering people, that's tricky, because whether it's chronic pain, whether that's surgeries, whether that's retirement, whether that's grief and loss from a spouse dying, or all those other things, we in recovery have to come to terms with a lot of things that we thought we had sort of left behind us or had never encountered before. So Broken, I had to live up to that story, and it was a good story. My new book, Broken Open, is one I get to live into.
So it's a W.
It's
some values.
Yeah, it could be a W. I hadn't thought, you know what? I've done a lot of podcasts and done a lot of media and so on, and I hadn't thought of, no one's ever called it a W. I'll have to think about that one. I would like to think that it is a W in the sense that I am on the upward swing again, and that's a good way to look at it. But I think for me more, it's like a roller coaster. I developed I had surgery for a dental procedure in 2012, and I was prescribed opiates. And I was prescribed those opiates by doctors who knew who I was. I was a public advocate for Hazelden. They knew I was in recovery. Those doctors had an intimate understanding of substance use issues. And yet they still prescribed them to me. Why? Because I was in pain, number one. And number two, they thought I could handle it. And very quickly, I discovered that I couldn't handle it. So, yeah, and I've come to terms with that, and we can talk about that if you want to. But my ride continues to be one where I've had some highs and some lows. Some of them have had to do with my substance struggles, and some of them have had to do with life on life's terms issues.
Well, I'm glad you brought this up with the dentist, because I've seen this firsthand with a family member needing some pretty big dental surgery. They're in recovery, newly in recovery, we should say, and then absolutely terrified of what the anesthesia, what the pain management option looks like, because to them, they felt one pill away from undoing all of the work that they had worked so hard on. So did your doctors either take your concerns seriously enough, or did they understand the unique nature of your struggles with addiction in considering your pain management option? Was the doctor, let's just say, was the doctor on board with understanding the gravity of the problem?
No, but that's not their fault any more than I understood the gravity of the problem. Hindsight is always what it is, right? It's 2020. But in 2012, we all assumed that I would be okay, that it would be a episodic experience with the dental surgery. I then developed a neuralgia in my jaw. And candidly, I'd had a good recovery and I liked my recovery. I didn't have any desire to go back to the crack house or to the bar, which was always my sort of MO. I'd always make a sharp right turn and go right back there. But I did love my recovery. The pain pills kind of took the edge off of my life. And I've always sort of lived on the edge of life just because I'm a hard-driven person. But the pain pills also worked with this neuralgia. What was fascinating to me, though, was that my program of recovery, which I had been working very successfully all those years, I chronicled it in Broken. And after that, my program of recovery, my faith in a higher power, and all those other tools that I had been using, they just were not enough to quiet my craving brain. And I think that was a startling revelation to me. My docs assumed I could handle it. I assumed I could handle it. I had all the resources and a track record to prove that I could handle it. But they say in recovery, a drug is a drug is a drug. That is not true when it comes to opiates. Opiates are a beast unto themselves. I call them the Trojan horse of addiction. They just kind of roll right in there very subtly. And the next thing you know, I couldn't get off of them of my own free will.
This is so important to hear you say this, William, because it's true. I've known it anecdotally for years. The grip of opioids is entirely different than most drugs. I don't know compared to methamphetamine or some of the others that I haven't had personal experience with,
Yes,
with loved ones. But it was very clear that it gripped them after a couple of days, that they liked it, that it spoke to them. But I need to push back a little bit on something here. And my listeners love it when I do that because I don't do it often enough.
You're doing it in a good way. So,
well, doctors, come on. I mean, look, opioids are easy. They're cheap. They're fast. People know what they want. Isn't there some complicity here over the years from industry? Like my father was a professor of medicine. I don't say this lightly, and I don't believe I pin fault on any particular, well-meaning practicing physician. However, there were pill mills. There were doctors who were flooding, of course, the eastern seaboard with pills, and then it hit Southern California, and the rest is history. But to some degree, they were easier, they were cheaper, it solved the problem a lot faster. Do you believe that we should be doing more to spur innovation in pain management? There are non-opioid alternatives in development and hopefully coming to market soon. Look, I'm not saying no opioids for people who need them. I get a lot of criticism for that. I got a couple of messages today. Mary, it's all your fault. Pain patients aren't being treated. I don't believe that's true. But I do believe that the doctors who treat pain need a bigger arsenal. And we should innovate in this space and say, hey, what is out there that's better than opioids?
And there are alternatives, to your point, exactly. We know that more today than we knew it a decade ago or 2 decades ago. And if candidly, Mary, we have to also go back to the root issue here, one of the root issues, which is medical schools do not do a very good job, even in 2024, when it comes to educating their students around issues related to addiction. They just don't do it. You can talk to any dentist or any doctor, and they'll tell you that in medical school, they were lucky if they got 2 or 3 hours of education around substance use disorders. And yet substance use disorders are oftentimes at the root cause of so many of the issues that doctors and dentists see. So sure, there was a component of complicity on the part of my dentists and my docs, but I have to own some of that, number one. Number two, they were ignorant in terms of the sort of cunning, baffling, powerful nature of addiction. I looked good on the outside, and truth be told, Mary, I still functioned. I still did those things that were really important to my appearance and important to my priorities, important to my life. So I probably pulled one over on people in a way that I hadn't really intended, but just was the nature of my beast. And again, I didn't go back to the crack house. I didn't take a drink. I didn't disappear from my job at Hazelden Betty Ford. I didn't embarrass myself in public. So I was an unusual case, but nevertheless, I also was able to, through my own story, underscore that nobody is immune to the ravages of substance use disorders, especially when it has to do with opiate pain pills.
Thank you. Just thank you. Because as you know, I was talking about this a long time ago. Hal Rogers and I, Congressman Rogers and I talked about this a long time ago. And I even felt that people in the treatment world were sort of looking at us sort of askewed, wondering what we were doing. But we felt that all of the governmental agencies that exist, there's over a dozen, right, just on the federal level, with some role in this, that they wanted future data to prove this was a problem rather than going on past data, or not. We didn't have the surveillance, we didn't have the numbers that truly reflected overdose deaths. Or, in our districts, congressional districts, you're seeing people dying. So you're trying to raise the problem, and other people are going, whoa, that's not really a problem. You're just being a hysterical mother. This is And so unfortunately, that cost us a lot of years, I think, on just putting some checks and balances back into place. And of course, we know the stories of all of that. We'll continue with our interview in a moment, but first I'd like to thank my sponsors. Lucy Pet Foods is the leader in gut health. Their formulas for life feature prebiotic, balanced fiber that nourishes your dog and cat's total health. Every purchase helps support the Lucy Pet Foundation, a 501c3 charity helping animals. Save 15% off your first order and use the promo code SAGELYSPEAKING, all one word, and you will get free shipping at lucypetfoods.com. If you're committed to tackling the opioid and addiction crises, then you need to be at the 2025 RX Summit. Use code SAGELY, that's SAGELY, for an extra $100 off. Join top experts and professionals as we share strategies for prevention, deflection, treatment, and recovery. Don't miss this chance to be part of the change. Head over to rx-summit.com to register now. That's rx-summit.com for an additional $100 off. And a thank you to Mothers Against Prescription Drug Abuse, driving solutions to prevent drug abuse and overdose deaths by focusing on prevention through education and awareness. Go to mapta.net for more information. And now, back to our interview. The new book is Broken Open.
Yes.
And it's newly out. You're about to do a big book tour. You looking forward to that?
Yeah, I like being out on the road. I'm getting kind of old to be out on the road in some ways. I mean, it is hard to travel, but I like it, and I love to be with people, whether it's in bookstores or in treatment centers or in the media, like you and I are doing in this moment. I love to engage because I love to carry the message, and I like to be with people who are of like minds with me. So I'm eager to do the book tour. I'll be in Alaska and Oregon and California to start, and then Atlanta next week, and then New York after that, and so on. I like being out and about because, I've always said, Mary, that addiction is an illness of isolation, and the antidote to it is community. And I love to be in community, whether it's the community of recovering people, their families, treatment professionals, or just the community at large. I like being out there. So I'm eager to do it. And also I'm eager to share this story because I think it's important that people understand that that addiction is a chronic illness, that it can come back, that we have to be vigilant when it comes to a narcotic or prescription pain pills or other pills. And also, I'm out to sort of educate constituencies around these truths that in fact, for this addict and alcoholic, who, by the way, still has not had a drink or been in a crack house since 1994, that for me, there was more to my recovery than sobriety. Now, sobriety is an important component of recovery for a lot of us, but I have, through my own experience, learned that even when I was struggling with those pills, I still revered my recovery. I still wanted to be a man in long-term recovery. And in 12-step programs or in sort of the popular culture, you can't possibly be in recovery if you're using any substance. That's just not true for me. So my book, Broken Open, is really a way to expand the tent and invite in more people to see that there are many pathways to recovery, and that for this fellow traveler, recovery is the most important thing I can do, even when I'm struggling in my sobriety.
This is powerful. So for a part of this cycle of the upward swing on the W, and hopefully it's the final upward swing, but this is life's journeys. And I love how you present this. But is medication assisted treatment part of the plan? This is new thinking, right? 20 years ago, you went in and maybe you detoxed, you came off of whatever substance you were on for however long it took you to medically get off. And then the goal was to taper everybody off to zero. That thinking, has it changed universally?
Well, it's a great question. There's a lot of resistance around the use of medications, anti-craving medications in the case of opioids or alcohol. At Hazelden Betty Ford, we're an abstinence-based program, right? We hang the 12 steps on the walls of all of our units, from the Palm Springs to Minnesota and everywhere else. And we'll always be oriented that way. But even we had to recognize about a decade ago that a lot of our patients were successfully completing treatment and then leaving treatment, having a recurrence of use on opiates and dying. So we began to incorporate into our abstinence-based program medications like Suboxone. We don't use methadone because that's a little bit more complicated in some ways, but we do use Suboxone, and we also use other anti-craving medications for alcohol use disorder, et cetera. There's still an amazing bias against the use of medications by some treatment providers, and more fundamentally, there's a lot of bias in the recovering community around the use of those medications. I needed an anti-craving medication. As I said earlier, I could not, of my own free will, from my faith or in the 12 steps, I could not shake this craving brain. So I needed an anti-craving medication that was prescribed to me by a doctor in Minneapolis, Dr. David Friends, in 2016. And it was like a miracle drug. Now, that by itself was not all I needed. I needed all those other recovery assets that I already had. But yes, there is a lot of bias in the treatment field and in the recovering community around these uses of these medications, which is why I think my story is also very important to emphasize the fact that for me, I needed it.
There definitely have been changes, challenges, and improvements in the field, it sounds like. And of course, the jury's not out on any of them, but it is why we call it the practice of medicine, right?
Yes.
Things change and move and improve, and sometimes they're denounced as that didn't work, or gee, sometimes we did harm. If we look at the history of medicine and sometimes the FDA. But this is a part of it. And but I'm glad to hear you say this and to talk about this, because I don't know. I don't have an opinion on this. I love people who do nothing, or they're on buprenorphine, but I think it's up to their doctor, to the patient, their doctor.
Yes.
It's not up to me telling them what I believe.
Well, that's the other thing. I've learned this. I've questioned. I don't want to say I've questioned, but I've pondered aspects of my long journey. I started my recovery in 1989 at the age of 30. So I've been doing this for more than half of my life now. And I have gone back and looked at those 4 treatments that I had over those 5 years. And there was no difference in those 4 treatments. They were all the same approach for this chronic patient between 1989 and 94. And I've looked back on it and say, why were they always the same? Why didn't it offer me something differently? Now, we've come a long way, and we recognize at Hazelden Betty Ford, and I think the field recognizes, we need to tailor or individualize our treatment programs or our treatment approach depending on a lot of dynamics in the patient. But I think the field has been slow to sort of evolve with the science and evolve with the medicine. And I'm not going to say anything to disparage how I got here, because I got here through 12-step recovery, and I owe a lot to that. But if I hadn't had the medicine in 2016, I don't know what would have happened to me. Maybe I would have, stumbled on. Maybe I would have died. I don't know. But we as a field have been slow to embrace change, and we as a field have been reluctant to see science and medicine as allies in what we're trying to do. That's why at Hazelden Betty Ford, we do use those medicines in an appropriate way as long as they're approved by the FDA.
But William, there have been changes over the past decade that I've been concerned about. I'm not saying that I didn't believe in them, but I've been concerned that are we taking the right path, the right approach. One of my problems, and I used to think about this a lot, with my absolute love for, let me just call it the Betty Ford Center, because that's who it was when the Fords were alive. What concerned me was that fly-by-night operators would stand up operations all over the country who didn't have the decades of experience, the decades of success that you all do. And that concerned me a lot. Were my concerns, were they right?
Absolutely. There are so many abuses in the field of addiction treatment. There are a lot of good nonprofits, and most people don't realize that Hazelden Betty Ford or the Betty Ford Center is a nonprofit. There are some really good nonprofits, and there are some good for-profit treatment centers. But because there's such a stigma around addiction, because it's such a misunderstood illness, there are, as you said, fly-by-night operators, or those who don't have the ethics, who take advantage, play into that stigma, play into that shame, and take advantage of patients and their families. That's not to say that Hazelden Betty Ford is a perfect organization, but the fact that we've been around for 75 years, the fact that the Betty Ford Center has been right there in the desert since 1982, it says something about our quality. It says something about our consistency. It says something about our commitment. We're not perfect, as I said, but we're pretty darn good at what we do. And you mentioned at the beginning of our broadcast that you talked about us being the gold standard. We are a gold standard. There are other programs that do measure up to what we do, but
I agree with that.
There are a lot that don't.
Right. No, I agree. I'm not saying, with all due respect, that you guys are the only.
Right.
And I do work with a handful of others who are just fantastic. Yeah. So many. But I also see dozens and dozens and dozens, or even sober living, which, of course, when these fly-by-night facilities open up and people fail, it sets everybody back. It really is. It's unfortunate. It ought to be a crime if it isn't already in certain states. I believe states are cramping down on that, but it really unfortunately sets everybody back. Not only the individual, but the family, the community, and the whole movement here on getting people healthy.
Well, you're spot on about that. That's one reason why the partnership between organizations like ours and insurance companies is really important, because insurance companies, we can complain about them from time to time, and they're always watching out for how long the length of stay is, right? For a patient. But the insurance companies also are pretty good at being able to sort of screen and monitor how that treatment is being delivered for their covered lives. And that's the partnership that Hazelden Betty Ford has with the insurance companies has been mutually beneficial in a way that I think says a lot about where the field is today.
That's great to hear, because that was a fight. That was a fight. And for them to be partners, again, let's go to prevention here. But if we can keep them healthier, it's a lot cheaper. So if we can get them healthy, keep them healthy, it's still cheaper. So I'm glad that they're a part of that journey, because obviously, primary prevention is my focus. I wish people would never pick up something, a substance that, like an illicit opioid, of course, and you can't ignore the fentanyl crisis in America. But something you mentioned earlier that you're 65 and old, and I can just see you right now buying a pickup truck and a camper, because that's what my husband and I are thinking about doing is, should we buy a camper and tour around the country? But you do talk about your IRA, and that is not your individual retirement account.
Right.
What is your IRA?
Thank you for asking that question. I have an individual recovery account. Now, I have an individual retirement account too. And, we don't save in those accounts under the assumption we're never going to draw down on it. Our goals are always to retire. And when we retire, we draw down, whether it's Social Security, our pension, our IRA, or 401, whatever it is. Well, I also have an individual recovery account, and I invest in that recovery account every single day. This morning, I read my meditations. while I drank my coffee here in my house in St. Paul. And that's a little investment in my IRA. And I do that because not only do I do it as part of my routine and I enjoy it, but I do it knowing that the day will come, as it did for me, when I will withdraw some things from that individual recovery account. And had I not invested as much as I had invested in my IRA, when I had my run-in or my recurrence of use with pain pills, if I hadn't had that kind of those assets in there, I'm not sure what would have happened to me. But an IRA is really important, and it starts the day we make the commitment to become a recovering person. It starts the day we say, I don't want to use those drugs or that alcohol anymore. It starts when we as a family go to a family program or start reading our meditations. For people in recovery and their families, everyone has to have an account that we invest in so that when we run into those hard times, we can pull out something from that and it can help lift us up. So my IRA, which I always was aware of, but I never called it an IRA until after, when I started writing Broken Open in 2018, I started thinking about my IRA and the importance that it plays for me and the importance it is that others also see that everything we do in the course of our days goes into that account for those times when we struggle.
Is this different from recovery capital that you talk about? It's
the same. Great question. And recovery capital is something that we have recognized both at Hazelden Betty Ford, and even the federal government's now recognizing the importance of recovery capital. And so for me, they're one and the same. And recovery capital is, like I said, all those things we do into our IRAs, but recovery capital is also having a job or being able to read or dealing with our criminal pasts or restoring our families. Recovery capital are those things that make this effort tenable, that make this journey sustainable. And everybody's got to have recovery capital if we want to carry on.
I'm a part of your recovery capital somehow, or your IRA somehow. Friends really matter. Yes. Is there anything about Broken Open that I've missed that you really want to get out?
Well, you nailed it. I'm impressed, really, and I appreciate the opportunity. The book has gotten a lot of good reception. It's been out a little over 3 weeks. I got a good piece in the New York Times. I did a national public radio with Scott Simon. I've had a lot of good response, but I've had some resistance to what I am writing about. Because people are either diametrically opposed to the use of medications, or they want to wonder how it was that my dentist didn't see what was coming any more than I saw what was coming. What I want people to know about this book is that this is how I did it. It's not how you should do it or you shouldn't do it. It's just how I did it. Far along that journey, like I said, 35 years I've been walking this walk in one way, shape, or form. Not sober the whole time, but committed to my recovery. So I think the biggest takeaway here is that this is how I did it. I hope that readers will find hope in it. I hope they'll find permission in it. I hope they'll see that there are many pathways to recovery, and that, just like we've always reminded people over the decades, it starts by asking for help.
Thank you. So recovery is possible. It sounds like a cliche, but it is true. But it's important to understand recovery is an ongoing process. It's a journey. Right. And you typify that so well and so beautifully. So I just wanted to thank you very much, William Moyers, for joining us and to talk about your career, your life, and your new book, Broken Open. I want to, again, thank you, and thank Hazelden Betty Ford for helping arrange your appearance here with me. I think I reached out to you first. I have no idea how it happened, but I was so honored when people said yes.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you for giving me this platform to carry that message to other people, because that's how we connect, and that's how we help people, by carrying that message of hope, help, and healing.
Thank you, William. So thank you for joining us. Stay positive and keep exploring. We'll catch you on the next episode.